Well, there's a class 1 error right at the beginning. I was muted. Sorry about that. Welcome everybody. My name is Christine Campbell. I'm the Senior Western Hub Manager with ALUS Canada, and I'd like to welcome you to the Ecobuffer and Shelterbelts Basics webinar. Just a couple really quick housekeeping things while everybody's kind of joining the room. We still have people trickling in here. Just a couple things. First is that we'll ask everybody to stay on mute because we do have a huge group. I'm very happy with the turnout today. We have a bit over 100 people registered, so that's fantastic. But we don't want to discourage you from asking questions. We would love lots of questions coming in throughout the evening. What you can do is put them down in the chat. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, if you're not that familiar with Zoom, you should see something that looks like a little thought bubble. And that's the chat window. It'll pop up if there's a notification with like a little red notification if somebody has made a comment in there. So you can also keep an eye on what questions people are asking throughout the session. We are also going to be recording this session. So if you are not okay with having maybe your image on a video that may get circulated on the internet at some point, you might want to turn your cameras off. But other than that, you're welcome to leave your cameras on, and that way we can see smiling faces and see if we're putting anyone to sleep or making anyone laugh or something like that. So we are presenting this webinar in partnership. We have ALUS Canada, Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, also known as AWS, and we have Northern Sunrise County putting this on. So we are very excited to work on this together. You're going to hear from Megan Andre and Bob Underschultz from AWS, Becky de Ballariola from ALUS Northern Sunrise, and then Karen Snethen and I will be monitoring the chat and watching for your questions and trying to keep those up at the appropriate time. So Bob and Megan, I guess I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, let me share my screen here. See if it works to share the portion that we need. There we go. Hi, I'm Megan Andre with Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. Tonight I'm here with Bob Underschultz, and we're here to talk about Shelterbelts and Ecobuffers. We're going over some of the basics, so a general overview tonight with more information to come Friday night session with advanced Shelterbelts. There we go. So firstly, we'd like to acknowledge that this presentation series and Oz, we would like to respectfully acknowledge we operate on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory and traditional Indigenous lands, as well as the homelands of the Métis. So I'm Megan, Executive Director with the Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. I've got some background with agriculture, reclamation, resource management, and in the not-for-profit industry. Bob Underschultz, he's joining us today, environmental technician, and his experience is in conservation management, and he has interest in the human-wildlife coexistence. So who is Oz? Well, we're a not-for-profit. Currently, we're operating in Alberta, and our mission here is to increase awareness of the economic, social, and environmental value of agroforestry and woodlots in the agricultural landscape. So to do that, we provide education and support, building capacity on the community level. So we work with landowners and rural residents, as well as acreage owners, land trusts, and various levels of government and industry to help increase awareness and to help people pull together great planting projects. So we're helping people successfully plant and have trees for years to come. So yeah, and we work with a lot of different or conservation organizations, many different municipalities, and restoring habitat through the establishment of trees. So we do operate with many members who support our organization through an annual membership. And this particular presentation, I have funding through ALUS as well as Northern Sunrise County. And then just to acknowledge the CAP, Government of Canada, and the Alberta Real Estate Foundation, who helped fund putting together our presentation initially. All right, and then we'll go into kind of the basics. So what is a shelter belt and what's it used for?
Okay, let me just set up my screen here and we'll get started.
Oh no, Bob.
Oh yeah, one sec. There we go. How's that? Awesome. Okay. So this basically today we're going to be going through some of the basic principles of shelterbelts and ecobuffers, and kind of introducing a lot of the different topics and design principles around those, with Friday's session being kind of the more advanced presentation as far as exploring more of the topics we present today more in depth, as well as going into site preparation and some more advanced assessments for shelterbelts and ecobuffers. So if we cover anything today and you're still not 100% on it, we'll hopefully be covering it more extensively on Friday's session. Shelterbelts. Basically, I'm sure lots of people have seen them around the countryside. So yeah, trees and shrubs acting as a physical barrier to environmental conditions. And those environmental conditions are usually abiotic or biotic stressors, such as wind, snow, water, pollutants, and invasive pests. So across the prairies, there's tens and thousands of these in terms of kilometers covered, and they can often be a single row of trees, multiple row of trees, and can be one tree species or multiple tree species. Certain species will have different pros and cons depending on the goals of your shelterbelt or the characteristics of the area that they're planted in. So as you can see in the picture here, we have looks like a 3-row shelterbelt with different species in each. So we got a shrub on the left, a taller deciduous trees in the middle, and on the far right we have coniferous trees. And usually the deciduous trees in the middle here probably are faster growing than the coniferous trees. So as this shelterbelt ages, you'll see a climax of the coniferous trees slowly becoming the dominant tree of the shelterbelt. Moving forward, so we also have the ecobuffer. And that's kind of has been more recently established idea as opposed to shelterbelts. And ecobuffers generally consist of mimicking the natural forest environment as opposed to shelterbelts, which are more designed to protect against generally wind and snow. So generally the main purpose or the reason that people would plant shelterbelts historically was to reduce wind speed and thus preventing erosion of the topsoil, which a common problem during the dirty 30s or the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression. And so the design ultimately of a shelterbelt will affect its ability in being able to reduce wind speed and over how great a distance that effect will have. So it's all about the overall design of the shelterbelt as well as the species that are selected will determine the effectiveness of the shelterbelt for windbreak. Like I said before, diversity is key. especially for resilience in a shelter belt. So in this one, this picture here, it's easy to see the different species thanks to the changing of the seasons. So we get some nice color there. Ultimately, when you have diversity, especially native diversity local to the area, you're going to have a greater resiliency as to invasive pests, climate change, and natural disturbances. Because the way that works is you'll have different species that can tackle those challenges, as opposed to having uniform species ultimately being wiped out by potentially one disturbance. You'll also be provided with more ecosystem services, the greater the diversity of a shelter belt. So different species will provide different habitat for wildlife, different food sources, different harvesting options, as well as better nutrient and water management overall, as we have. Just unmute me there. As we have different species that are compatible with others. So you start to develop beneficial nutrient relationships, with some species being better at water management than others. And different species will age and climax differently and at different rates. So a good example would be, aspen and balsam poplar will age faster and die faster than, say, spruce planting, which will age more slowly and eventually replace pioneer species such as aspen and balsam poplar. And ultimately, by utilizing different species at different aging rates, you can maintain a full shelter belt over a longer period of time. Oh, there we go. So yeah, big question. Why do we need shelter belts? So I've already covered some of the main benefits of those, but we'll dive into that primary cause, which is ultimately to reduce wind speed. So not as pertinent today with some of the changes we've had in agricultural systems, especially the change to no-till systems. But it is a reminder of where we have been and what we're trying to avoid bringing back. So ultimately, like I said before, reducing wind speed, you're reducing that soil erosion. You're also helping with snow trapping. So depending on the design and the species selection for your shelter belt, you can harvest snow for recharging soil moisture in the spring melt, as well as redirecting where that snow accumulates to avoid steep embankments of snow. As well as you'll have improved microclimates for crops. So again, that comes into effect by shelter belts protecting from abiotic stressors, such as too much sun, and effectively using evapotranspiration process to create cooling microclimates. And lastly, shelter for livestock and your farmyard or your homestead. So numerous studies have shown, like with shelter belts, the overall quality of health for livestock improves. And again, that's mainly from preventing those environmental stressors and acting as a physical barrier for that. So yeah, so some studies have shown, like with sheltered beef cattle, 35 pounds more weight gain with shelter belts, and ultimately using less feed. That's kind of due to keeping livestock warmer, especially during the winter, by reducing that wind chill that can be found across open spaces. Ultimately reducing the stress on the animal due to weather, whether it's cold, rainy, or hot. And then for homesteads, ultimately you can reduce energy costs as far as heating. So again, mainly goes down to the wind chill. So that physical barrier that trees can act as can have a lot of benefits across the acreage. And then there's aesthetic appeal. So that's something that I know always looks nice surrounding an acreage, more trees as opposed to an open landscape. And it's been shown to increase real estate value in terms of showcasing barren versus a treed landscape. And then there's many other additional benefits of shelter belts, and that kind of goes into the ecosystem services aspect. With filtration, absorption of pollutants and sediments, so a lot of that comes down to the root systems, basically trapping pollutants moving through the groundwater, absorbing excess nutrients from fertilizers on agricultural land, as well as slowing down runoff, whether it's from frictional resistance from above ground vegetation, or essentially when it's raining, acting as umbrellas that slow down the rundown of water onto the land. As well as root systems of trees create macropores in the soil, which aid with the infiltration of water into the soil rather than it just straight running off the ground. So ultimately, it kind of changes the ground into more of a sponge. That way, the water doesn't run off in intense water events. And that kind of goes into the flood and drought mitigation. And then the groundwater recharge, again, by trapping snow, you can recharge the soil moisture come to spring melt. And you can also design shelter belts to run off into dugouts or swales on the land. And then carbon capture, which is a big thing these days with climate change. So lots of trees will capture carbon in their above ground biomass as well as below ground with their influence on the soil. So statistically, a 5-row kilometer long shelter belt can sequester over its lifetime around 2.19 tons of carbon, which kind of adds up to the equivalent of driving 1.5 million kilometers with the average vehicle. So yeah, trees pretty powerful in terms of helping with climate mitigation. As well as there's some secondary specialty products that can be derived from shelter belts. So that's whether it's fuel for firewood or secondary timber products through selective harvesting, and then food through like simply collecting if Saskatoon berries, say, are part of your shelter belt or other shrubs and fruit producing trees. And then that ultimately plays into providing food for livestock or wildlife in the area. And then so there's a couple different options as far as establishing a shelter belt. So if you're lucky enough, there's already trees there on your land, and nature's done the planting for you, and now it just needs a little encouragement. So options for improving an existing treed area into a shelter belt include generally pro-forestation efforts. So that would mean encouraging outgrowth in the right direction. So you can do that from underplanting in the understory or root pruning to induce suckering in species such as aspen or balsam poplar, basically encouraging them to expand. And ultimately, you can do this by reducing disturbance too. So this is another arm of pro-forestation, where if it's on land that's hard to farm, maybe it shouldn't be farmed, as well as certain areas may offer greater benefits as treed areas rather than cropland or pasture land. So a lot of these would fall into riparian areas, so areas around water bodies, and areas that are more prone to erosion. So by planting around these areas, you're protecting water sources through those filtration benefits, as well as locking down the soil in erosion-prone areas. So these areas especially benefit by having a treed buffer or a shelter belt or ecobuffer surrounding them. And then you get the benefits of protected water sources and a reduction in erosion on your land. And then we have some example of root pruning here. So essentially cutting into the land there, and that would encourage suckering from the trees, if you see on the bottom right picture along the border, essentially going underground and coming up as clones of a previous tree. So aspen trees are a really good example of that. And there's an example in the States called Pando, which is one of the world's largest living organisms. And basically it's a huge aspen forest that can be traced back genetically to one single aspen tree. So they're pretty powerful in terms of expansion. And root pruning essentially encourages that. And then option C, you have to do the planting yourself, which is can be just as effective, and you have better control over the design process. And that's considered afforestation, so taking an area of the land that previously wasn't forested and changing that to a treed area. So that involves a little more prep as far as getting the soil ready and choosing the right trees for the area, as well as maintenance after the fact through weed control and potentially watering. So when you're looking at site assessment and you want to figure out your goals. So ultimately you want to figure out what services, ecosystem services that you want your shelter built to provide and where you want those services. So you got to consider the site of your the characteristics of the site you're planning to plant on. So kind of comes down to, soil, light, moisture, wind, all those abiotic factors that are going to be very influential on your design, as well as what the land use is going to be like. Is it going to be by cropland or livestock going to be incorporated into the design, as well as bordering areas and their land use. One example would be if you're close to a feedlot and you want to get rid of some odor control, setting up a dense shelter belt or ecobuffer can help with some of that odor and noise pollution. And it's always important to pick native species to your local area, as suitable species will flourish with a design that works with the nature and the use of the land, and will ultimately provide you with long-term success rather than a short-term failure as far as choosing the wrong species for the area. So here we have an image from Cohen Farms, which is in Alberta, and they are establishing swales as well as they have already established shelter builds in the area. So this is kind of an interesting photo as far as shelter build design, and kind of identifies how you can work with the land with the topographic features and the landscape. So when you're looking out to set up your site for a shelter build, kind of want to look at, like I previously mentioned, design, and then tree selection, and then prepping that area. And then you go into kind of the business side of things, which would be sourcing stock, figuring out how you're going to be planting that, and then afterwards looking for that monitoring and maintenance, which ultimately comes down to weed control, potential watering, and checking for any pest, control as far as, if there's any invasive pests such as, vole damage on young seedlings and stuff like that. So design, ultimately, where and why are two big ones. So where are you planting and why do you want to plant it there? So everybody's going to have different reasons, whether it's primarily for blocking wind, or if you want it for connecting wildlife habitat together and creating a travel corridor, or like I said before, blocking out unpleasant odors or noise pollution from neighbors, or it's essentially just creating an aesthetically pleasing addition to your land. And each of those options will ultimately pick different species. Easy way to kind of initially plan it out is using Google Maps or Google Earth. Google Earth is really awesome for that. And ultimately you can kind of map out your area, figure out your planting zone. And especially since it's the satellite imaging, it's an nice way to check back or through over the years to see the changes and improvements. And we also have Oz has a Google Earth tutorial that we'll go through near the end of the presentation. And it's a nice planning document for figuring out how that works, as well as in our other presentations, especially a riparian management one we have coming up later this spring. We'll have a full demo of that. Another big thing is looking long-term, and that includes facilities that are nearby. So if you're planting trees in an area where power lines, cable lines are present, even underground water lines, sewer lines, kind of the classic call before you dig, right? So in terms of power lines, cable lines, you have that that vertical limit. So when you're planting trees, if you're planting in an area around there, you have to consider how tall or how wide these trees are going to grow, and if that's going to be a problem later on, as well as say with sewer and water lines. Different root systems will expand differently, especially ones that sucker out. So it's always important to consider those boundaries. And kind of everything else kind of follows along that way. Sidewalks with roots pushing them up, and right-of-ways and easements, as well as property on your land. So planting too close to buildings, or worrying about underground basements being potentially penetrated by roots. So another design principle is orienting the shelterbelt accordingly. So you always want to make sure that you're designing them with the prevailing winds of your area in mind. So that being said, you want to ideally perpendicular to those prevailing winds. That way they can be the most effective. So I know up in where we're located in Alberta, those during the winter tend to come in a northwesterly approach. So if you're interested in snow catchment, designing that in the correct way can ultimately lead to longer term success rather than having to replant or change your plans down the road. And that kind of goes into this slide where it's, you trap snow where you want it. So with shelter belts, ultimately the height of the shelter belt, if you double that and then add that to the leeward side, which would be the inward facing side, that kind of shows you where that snow is going to be accumulating. So you can see in the two images below, you have housing and then really close to the shelter belt, and it's basically getting sandwiched by that snow, which is not ideal. Whereas on the right here, we got a nice drift and nothing close by to be potentially covered in too much snow. So it's all about designing that and keeping in mind that height to horizontal ratio there. Here's a really good example. So it's a kind of a small scale example in this image. So it's only 2.4 inches tall, that slit fence there. And it kind of shows the effect it has on distributing that snow. In this example, the upwind deposition of that snow reaches out to about 5 times that height of that fence. And that kind of comes down to what we're going to be talking next is density. So as those slats fill up with snow, the next slat above will distribute the snow accordingly. So the way that works with trees is different species will have different densities. So a more dense tree or shelter belt will deposit that snow closer and in a heavier pack, versus a less dense shelter belt where it'll evenly distribute that snow over a wider area, but it won't be as deep. Here's another example of how it can go wrong as far as the shelter belt and snow catchment. So you can see the houses are completely buried in the snow deposit. And basically, at some point in this picture, the shelter belt was established, and then they built too close to the shelter belt. So within that two times height area. So always a good thing to avoid. And that kind of goes into creating different or multiple layers in your shelter belt. So you can see the top layer, you have a low row of shrubs, followed by some taller deciduous and possibly some more coniferous back there, as opposed to the bottom one where you have short shrubs with gaps on the bottom in terms of the foliage. So basically, benefit of having those multiple layers is you can provide different wildlife habitat, which is more beneficial for wildlife corridors by creating those different layers in the canopy. And like I was mentioning before, you have improved snow catchment and even dispersal. So you can control that dispersal over a wide area at less accumulation. So that will benefit a lot more if your goal is to increase soil moisture come the spring melt, if it's distributed over a larger area at a lower height rather than one big dump that's really close to the shelter belt. As well as with different densities, that plays into differing aspects in wind reduction. And it also helps to create more of a dome shape, which reduces wind turbulence against the shelter belt. So here we have a slide that kind of shows different densities and species. So on the lower end, we got some trembling aspen, medium, ash and larch, and then high, which would be kind of the spruces or coniferous trees. So basically, as that wind goes through each one, you know, the spruce is acting more as a wall, whereas these other ones are more porous, and it allows the wind to pass through, but it's still reducing that as opposed to hitting a high density wall and causing some turbulence. And again, like I mentioned before, kind of creating that dome shape. So in kind of more traditional or older shelter builds, you tend to see just a single row of trees in a wall design. And what can happen there is that in high wind scenarios, especially with spruce trees or white spruce that have shallow root systems, it just smacks into those trees and ultimately can uproot them through the sheer force, as well as causing greater turbulence on either side as the wind goes up and over. Whereas if you have more of a ramp on either side, creating that dome shape with differing levels of porosity and height, basically that wind can smoothly pass over and through the shelter build. And that, you know, ultimately means that you're going to have less intense wind speeds passing through the shelter built, but at the same time not causing any structural damage to the shelter built or any resulting wind turbulence coming off that shelter built. And that kind of introduces the spacing critique. So leaving adequate spacing for growth in terms of different species as well as in terms of their density can help with that filtering wind and snow through the shelter built. And that basically will help prevent an overaccumulation of that snowpack. Whereas, you know, the shorter layers will help catch the snow initially, basically spreading it out through the shelter built. And taller layers will let through some of the snow, especially if they have less porosity. But again, ultimately slowing down wind, slowing down snow, and spreading it out over a larger area and basically dispersing that force. So it's not as aggressive. And now we're going to kind of introduce Oz's native tree species database, and it's a really useful tool to find trees and shrubs local to your area that are going to be best suited for planting and ultimately have the best long-term success. So I'm going to pass it off to Megan, and she's going to kind of walk us all through that. Oh, I think you're still muted there, Megan.
Hi, there we go. How many times will we do that tonight?
Yeah.
All right, so Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society, we've developed a tool kind of free for anyone who comes across it to learn more about Alberta's native trees and shrubs. So these native trees and shrubs, they're the species that are going to be the most capable of overcoming some of our severe weather events that happen in Alberta. So those early or late frosts, the high precipitation or low precipitation events, all those wind events that come up, these are your trees that are most adapted to handle our local conditions. And they're most adapted to to live with all of our native species. So if you're looking for plants that will be the best habitat for our native wildlife, some of your native species are your best choices here. So our database, it can be found right on the top of the screen there. You just click on that and you'll come to a page much like this. So here you can select different categories along the side. So I've got boreal selected here, and that'll be the boreal region of northern Alberta. And from there, you can select your plant type, the maximum height, growth rate. Are you looking for something edible? In the boreal, we've got, let's go with a moist soil regime. That's something that be probably most suited. And then from there, you can look at all of your different species that match your criteria. So if you're putting together your shelter belt and you're looking for a tall shrub suited for the boreal forest and it's a moist area, you can look to all of these examples here. So from there, making your selection, you can click on your picture and it'll come up with some more information on your species. Do you want to see what the little seedling you're planting looks like? There's a picture in our database for that. Some photos of the leaves and different stages of development. All right. Let's see. Yeah, so you can play around in this tool, look at different species, narrow this as much as or as little as you would like to select the native species that are ideal for your site, and always choose what you want best. So choose tree services that you will value or will be valued on your property, because those trees that grow the fastest, those trees that live the longest, are the trees that you value, the trees that you are able to add able to look after and are interested in looking after. So be it going out to inspect your newly planted trees or going out to harvest berries from your shelter belt or ecobuffer, those are the trees that you'll keep an eye on, and potentially you'll be more able to head off any problems before they become too big of an issue. Let's see. So some more information. Let's go back to that PowerPoint presentation here. Oh, that's almost right. All right. So we want to choose diverse species that are adapted to your site. You're going to look toward native species, and your planting doesn't need to be completely composed of native species, but having some native species in there will definitely help overcome some of the more severe events that may damage your planting. So some common shelter belt trees. So when people are thinking of shelter belts, typically they're going back and thinking of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, so the PFRA. So that's that group that was founded in the early 1990s, and they provided free trees to landowners for the development of shelter belts. So thinking back on that, they were providing trees for field shelter belts to reduce wind erosion events. Think back to that picture that Bob showed where that farmyard was full of dust. They were looking to mitigate some of those extreme conditions. They're looking to catch snow. Those early years in the 90s were often very dry, and they were looking to reduce moisture loss in your field. So to plant those tall shelter belts and slow that wind down. As well, doing some of that, providing some of those same benefits for farmyards. They were increasing privacy in your yard, so capturing some of that dust before it made it to your home. They were lowering your bills, and they were helping protect your farm and home from snow accumulation, snow events as well. So now we're planting shelter belts for a lot of the same reasons, but a lot of different reasons as well. So when you're looking at your shelter belt, you want to choose species that are going to provide you with the services that you're looking for and are not going to be doing some of the things that potentially you're not looking for. So when you're looking at some common deciduous trees for your planting, they're are lots of attributes that you may be looking to have in your shelter belt and maybe looking to avoid. For example, Manitoba maples here, you'll get, they're really highly regenerative. So they'll be suckering up perhaps too frequently into the yard of your homestead, and that might be something that you wish to avoid. Planting something with less potential for suckering. So you want to carefully consider the species that you're choosing and choose those that are best suited. There's a lot of different options as well, now taking it from native or non-native species, and a lot of them have similar attributes. So you can look to those lists for the tree that's perfectly suited for your planting. Let's see, so we have a list of common deciduous trees here. Yeah, again, Manitoba maple, green ash, hybrid poplar. I know if you're looking at hybrid poplar, one of the most frequent varieties chosen would be the Okanese poplar. And that's one of the more traditional shelter belt trees that you'll see planted in those traditional shelter belt plantings, and that's because it has branches kind of going right up from the top to the ground. So it's providing coverage all throughout the tree, not kind of shedding those lower branches. All right, so some common evergreen trees. So we've got our typical suspects there, and native species, with the exception of the Colorado spruce. And so the Colorado blue spruce, that was added in, or it has become frequently used in shelter belts in Alberta, simply because it has that medium tolerance to salty conditions. So that's the one to choose if you're looking to plant where there may be maybe some salt in your soil. It's not really highly tolerant of salt, but a little bit more so. Let's see, common shelter belt shrubs. So when you're going for that ramp that I highly recommend you look for in your shelter belt, and it does take a bit of additional space to kind of plant your 3-row shelter belts, preferably 5-row shelter belts, to get that ramp shape in there. You want to choose some shrubs to kind of head off that wind and push that wind up above your taller species. You can look at, we've got a list of a few species, really common species here, and there's many other species as well. You'll find those in the native species database. Let's see, first on our list, we can't go through a shelter belt presentation without talking about Caragana. So Caragana, all right, it's a legume, it fixes nitrogen, very, very common with the PFR8 plantings. Who wouldn't love a Caragana? I mean, they fix nitrogen, neutralize the soil, stabilize the soil, they establish so rapidly and vigorously, they sucker. But I mean, if you're not looking for something to sucker everywhere and be extremely hardy and difficult to remove, there's some other choices to consider. So lots of good things with Caragana, but I guess one of the questions Oz receives most often on Caragana is, how do I get rid of this Caragana? So it's become invasive in a lot of places. So if you're looking at driving through some beautiful rural countryside and you're coming up on some riparian areas, take a close look at that riparian buffer zone, because a lot of times you're going to see Caragana in there, and that's not something that's really desirable. Like, it's a good species that attracts pollinators, but it's invasive and it's a non-native, so it's out competing some of our great native vegetation that's most suited for those native species. So that's something to consider there. What instead? So no Caragana. Okay, so Megan, what should I plant instead of Caragana? Well, you want to look to your native species that are going to provide some of the same benefits of Caragana, but they're going to also be that ideal habitat for your native animals in the area. So let's see, I would choose perhaps buffalo berry, soapberry, or let's go with buffalo berry. So soapberry, so that's a native. It has a lot of the same attributes as Caragana. Here we have it down here. Soapberry, because when you cook those berries, it makes that foamy residue in there. So that's where that name comes from. It'll be approximately the same height. Again, it creates a fairly dense medium, low bush, and it prevents that wind from penetrating it there. So it's a great planting with a lot of the same attributes, and it's a native species. So that's something that is great to consider. Dogwood as well as high bush cranberry, those are two other options depending on the moisture regime of your site. You want to consider all of those factors. So some tips, let's see. So plant as many trees as you can care for. So that's one of the main tips that we can offer folks, or one of the most important tips. So we have lots of farmers and landowners coming to Oz, and they are really keen. They want shelter belts and eco-buffers. They really are excited to have these established trees on their property. They're looking for tree services, and why not? More trees, more tree services. But if you overdo it and you can't care for all of these trees, and you don't have the capacity, be it the water or the time or the weed management, to care for these trees, especially in the first few years while they're becoming established, you'll end up having trees lost, more trees lost. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. If you have the capacity to take on the size of the planting that you are considering. So perhaps planting in phases would be something that Oz highly recommends. So doing some of those pioneer species, they're a little bit hardier. They may put a couple rows of those in and start establishing those, and then come in later once they're established and don't require so much maintenance, and you can plant your other more sensitive species protected by those pioneer species, and then develop your shelter belt in phases that way. For example, like a large shelter belt, or really assess if there are other areas that you can draw capacity from for your shelter belt. So perhaps adding irrigation lines, a drip irrigation in your field, so that you don't have to be out there with your water truck watering every single one. It maybe does that for you. Would be something to consider. As well, there's a lot of grant options out there, so you can source funding to cover some of these costs. And that would be something to consider and plan for when you're developing your planting. I've spent a long time on that one. All right, I'll move on. So avoid any openings or access roads in your shelter belt. You want to be careful about what's located around your site where you're planting. You want to protect shelter belts from livestock. So you want to ensure that you have fencing in place, at least for those first few years. Those new baby trees are delicious. And there's going to be browse from native animals out in the landscape are going to be browsing on these, as well as if you have livestock in that area, they're going to go after those nutritious baby trees. Ensure that you include fruit-bearing shrubs, diversity. There's a lot of different native species that are looking for berries out in our landscape, and depending on what you're looking for, if you're looking to establish that consistent row of shelter belt trees, you'll want to replace any lost trees fairly quickly to ensure consistent growth along your shelter belt over time. So you don't want to have that hole in your shelter belt. It can create a wind tunnel, funneling wind through the hole where trees have potentially been lost. And if too much time passes and the remaining shelter belt establishes itself fully, that wind tunnel is going to make a harsh environment for your infill plants to grow. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at filling in some of those holes in your shelter belt from lost trees. Let's see, some tools that we've mentioned previously. So you want to look at planning your shelter belt based on your site conditions and the trees that you've chosen, as well as the different capacities that you have to manage and look after your trees. You want to diversify, and you want to make sure you're using at least some local species in your planting. Site preparation, Bob went over that. So you want to look at preparing the site, be it through tilling, rototilling, spraying for any weeds that might be in the area already, planting cover crops, getting some biodegradable mat down or hemp mats around the plantings. And then you want to plan for once your plants are there. So you want to plan your weed control and your watering and your monitoring. So that doesn't have to be formal monitoring. That can be visiting your shelter belt, going out, checking if the berries are ripe, going out, walking through, checking on that shelter. How much warmer is it next to your shelter belt on those winter days? Speaking of which, do you have porcupines eating your new trees? And just daily monitoring is always key. Keeps on top of those problems before they impact all of your trees. So that's something important to consider. Oh, so meanwhile, in nature, those of us lucky enough to have plants, shelter belts already, ecobuffers already. What happened here? Sorry. Meanwhile, in nature, those of us lucky enough to already have some buffers and shelter belts on our property, we can already see some of the differences there between a shelter belt, a traditional shelter belt planting where you see that single species grown in several rows forming the buffer, to how plants are growing in nature. So what if we took a lesson from nature? So what if we planted diverse trees and shrubs with different characteristics, different rates of suckering, nitrogen fixing, different tree services. We planted them in a high enough density that they would support each other. And we arranged them to connect with existing natural areas and to buffer ecologically sensitive areas. So to provide some of the services that are provided through natural planting systems. So this is how our trees evolved to grow and how they evolved to support each other and support all of our different native species. So an ecobuffer, I guess we're talking about an ecobuffer. So you've seen Bob's picture here, classic ecobuffer, all of the different species highlighted through their fall colors. So 3 rows, it's about 5 meters wide. So you're planting these species a lot closer together. There's not a lot of bare ground space between them. They're forming that wedge shape again, so that wind kind of goes up and over without causing too much turbulence. And there, look, this one's got some good height on it after only 16 years. They're supporting each other, the trees in an ecobuffer planting. So all of them growing together, you're going to see faster growth rates for your trees than the individual rows of single species planted in a traditional shelter belt. Here we've got an example from the old site of the PFRA, Indian Head, Saskatchewan, about 14 years old, along the side of the road there. All right. So the ecological roles of native trees and shrubs in our forest. So short shrubs, we've got some good example here. That's the understory of your ecobuffer. And so that provides a lot of the understory benefits, great ground cover. So that's going to outcompete any weed species that may be blowing in off the neighboring agricultural fields. It's going to provide excellent habitat for a lot of those smaller animals out there, your rabbits. Taller shrubs are going to provide that intermediate canopy layer. Saskatoon's chokecherries, those are going to be excellent sources of protection and food for birds visiting your ecobuffer. You'll want to look at your pioneer or your nurse species. So these are your fastest growing trees. They provide shelter and benefits for a lot of your other longer growing or longer living species. And these nurse trees, they're especially, and I suppose those tall shrubs as well, they're highly suckering. So they're going to regenerate really quickly. If there's an event that knocks those back, they'll regenerate and quickly replace themselves, maintaining that protection for your longer lived species like white spruce, black spruce, lodgepole pine. So these long-lived species will eventually fill in and dominate your planting, and they will be the species that provide are there for the longest. So they'll be established and they'll stick around for quite a long time. So here we have a picture of that, that layering of your planting. So you can see your shrubs and your intermediate there. You've got your spruce trees in your plantings. So there's lots of differences between traditional shelter belts and your ecobuffers. So ecobuffers, you've got native species, diverse mix of trees and shrubs, and they're all planted kind of mixed together in their rows. They're planted at a very high density, outcompete some of those invasive species that may come along, and they can create a buffer, an excellent buffer around ecologically sensitive areas. So if you're looking at a planting that's protecting perhaps a wetland or a creek, you want to look at an ecobuffer to provide the most services for wildlife or native species in your area. And I guess the goal there is to capture the entire site through suckering. So you're going to create a planting with the intent of creating that density and longevity that will protect the site going forward. So you can see on the left here, more of a traditional shelter belt with some of that grass growing in the bottom there, your trees, single species grown in rows. And then you can see here your ecobuffer creating that natural wedge shape, and it's a dense planting of many different species. So with your ecobuffers, some of the benefits of that are you don't need weed control for as long, I suppose, as your traditional shelter belt. So some traditional shelter belts, you're going to mow around those trees or till around those trees for many, many years to keep the weeds and pests down. They're not planted as dense as the ecobuffers. So for ecobuffers, just like shelter belts, you can choose to mow down the rows if you you want to plant with the spacing to make sure you accommodate your mower. You can use a biodegradable mulch here. You can see this biodegradable plastic mulch, 3-year, 5-year, depending on the density suited to how long you want to have that mulch in place. You can use a pulp mulch or a hemp fiber mulch. And then those also suited to how many years you want those in place. You can buy them 3 years, 5 years, depending on the thickness and the care you get there. This example, they're running, it looks like a rototiller to keep the weeds down in between there. Oz recommends a cover crop for sure, something like that there. So there's disadvantages, I suppose, of ecobuffers as well. So one of the main disadvantages, I suppose, in planting a denser configuration, I guess, you're looking at the cost, a higher cost for trees. So this is a one-time investment, or maybe 1 or 2 year investment as you're replacing some trees that don't make it. But you're looking for a large upfront investment for a long-term gain. So this ecobuffer is going to have a significantly higher amount of trees planted initially, but you're going to see that longevity through suckering and through regeneration of your shelter belt for many years to come. So some of the benefits, I guess, what we mentioned earlier, you've got this row here for shelter belts that you're going to maintain for a long time. And with your ecobuffer, here is filling in. So kind of the same time frame we're looking at for both of these plantings. Advantages of your ecobuffer, we've got a presentation here with, here we go. So minimize the distance between rows. In about 2 years, you're gonna cut down on your maintenance for your ecobuffer. You need to replace less trees because these trees are suckering. Density, it doesn't compromise the growth of the species. So when you're selecting your species for your eco buffer, you're going to look at species that are going to complement each other. So there'll be companion planting. So these species, especially native species, have developed to complement each other. So if one is potentially protecting the other from pests in the area, another fixing nitrogen, and another helping to reduce weather events. So these trees work together to help each other grow, and they work together to help each other propagate and help each other regenerate. So that's a planting that's built for sustainable impact to the landscape. So there's high carbon sequestration. With that high density of trees being grown together, you're going to see a high density of carbon sequestration as well. And then you're going to see just a magnification of all of your other shelter belt benefits. So if you're looking to see a large berry production, for example, you're going to see greater diversity with your ecobuffer, as well as the success of the berries will be higher. For example, they'll be protecting each other and eliminating opportunity for different pests and disease to move through the planting. With the traditional shelter belt, if you have a flock of waxwings, for example, move through there, they're going to easily clean off your row of Saskatoons. But if you've got some diversity there and some protection from different species all planted together, there's going to be more likely there'll be a tree that they miss. So you'll have more opportunity for berries yourself, and the birds also have more opportunity. Win-win. Let's see, this slide is pretty small. Oh, ecobuffer functions and their corresponding design recommendation. All right, so we've got some information plugged into this slide with quite a bit of detail here. We've got different considerations and recommendations for some of the tree services that you're looking for. So our first point here, if you're looking for the function of your ecobuffer to protect your livestock, you want to plant different species with different characteristics in mind. So you want to look at your height, you want to look at your spacing, and you want to look at the different species that you have planted there to achieve the benefits that you're looking for. So there's customized ecobuffers for all of the different applications that you're looking for. So shelter for livestock, if you're looking for soil conservation, water quality protection, there's an ecobuffer planting mix that can work with, work with the services you're looking for. So that being said, Oz has a great number of resources on our website available, as well as our staff are available to help design ecobuffers or shelter belts, riparian buffers, and other plantings. One of these resources that we spoke about earlier is looking at doing an assessment worksheet, or at least thinking through an assessment worksheet before considering your planting. So what is an assessment worksheet? Let's see if I can navigate the screen share to show you. Oh, stop share. All right. There we go. All right, so on our Oz website, if you're gonna look in resources and you want to work in your worksheets and workbooks, and then you can select Oz Planting Assessment Worksheet. So in here, we've provided, so this is the sheet that our Oz staff kind of think through or collect information on when we're coming out to do an assessment on a property to determine what to plant and what are some of the things to consider when developing a planting plan. So we're looking to figure out what problems landowners are looking to solve. So do they have excess wind? Is there dust blowing in from the road? Is there noise from a nearby property? And we're looking to plant trees that are going to be solving those problems or growing towards solving those problems. How long has it been a problem? And then do you know why it came to be a problem? So we're looking to gather some information on the site characteristics to get a good understanding of what is going to work. What's going to work and what trees are going to be best suited for helping to solve the problem, and as well what success looks like to you. So if it looks like potentially making that beautiful healthy row of white spruce visible from your living room window, so that you don't have to look at the road and the dust and the noise from the road doesn't bother yourself while you're sitting on your deck, that's something that we can work with, and that's something that that's totally okay. It's what works for you. Your trees, and you're going to look after them in the future, and you're going to enjoy them. So you want to make sure that's the planting that works best for you. So are you looking for some other ecosystem services as well? There's lots of opportunity for that. We don't have to plant for just one service. We can also focus on snow capture, wildlife habitat on that, the other side of that white spruce. Potentially we can plant Saskatoons for foraging, berry collecting, make some pies. There's lots of opportunity there. How quickly do you want to achieve all of this? So do you want that protection right away? Are you willing to see some additional suckering to get some of those faster growing species? And then another thing to consider, what help do you need to get you there? So do you need some additional funding to help with your project, potentially to cover mounding, perhaps, if you're planting an uneven terrain and you're not able to do some of the more traditional site preparation? So once we've kind of established what our goals are for planting, we're going to look at the site characteristics. So you want to work through kind of a general description, history, and assessment of the land. How often do you get huge flood events on your property? How often do you have a lot of porcupines? That's something to consider. If you're based on your planting, that can be a problem. Looking at the site itself, moisture regime, how much light, prevailing winds, different soil textures. Keep in mind your plant hardiness zone, that changes kind of throughout the province depending on where you're at. Is there a sod mat? How thick is it? That sod can be a problem with your little trees. They're going to need some protection so that they can outcompete any established native grasses. And then if you do have those native grasses or invasive grasses there, or weeds, how tall are they? How prevalent are they? So you want to look at some preparation and maintenance to give those trees a chance, especially in the early years of your planting. All right, so animals, livestock, different native species, and then any human obstacles. So you want to avoid planting your shelterbelt or ecobuffer too close to your property, depending on the services that you're looking for. I know my house here, I've got some very large blue spruce that, blue spruce that caused some damage to the house. They were planted too close when they were little, and now they've grown up to be monsters. So you kind of want to keep in mind the maximum size that trees will grow. Let's see. So project plan. So once you've taken all of your factors into consideration, you want to look at, is planting advisable? Perhaps there's some prep that needs to be done. Speaking of an example, we had over the last couple of years, some very invasive Canadian thistle. And this Canadian thistle, we thought we had it covered. You know, we used some herbicide and we had some great preparation, but it turned out, you know, our planting could have used an extra year of preparation to make sure we had that Canadian thistle completely taken care of. Keeping in mind, a lot of times in disturbing the roots of some of these, some of the grass species, also Canadian thistle, you're gonna have a lot more coming up when those roots are disturbed, especially through something like rototilling. You're going to look at soil compaction in your project plan. Is that something that you'll need to mitigate? Moisture, lack of moisture, herbicide drift. So depending on wind conditions and nearby agricultural practices, you'll want to keep in mind a lot of trees are sensitive to herbicide drift. And then you'll go into developing your project plan. So that can be something that you develop and evolve, and it can evolve over time as you're developing your site preparation conditions, or potentially as you plant your trees in phases, you can keep your plan in mind and update it and develop it as needed. So you want to keep in mind what you had as your original goals and problems that you're looking to solve, and then plant perhaps your primary species, your pioneer species, get some of that cover in place, get some, well, I've heard it called a tree guild before. So you have species that complement and support each other, and they protect each other from different extreme conditions, and it's easier to establish that way. So in setting up those initial species, you can build on your project from there, and your planting plan will be essential in keeping yourself on track. Let's see. And then I think for some of our other tree services or tree resources, in the chat earlier, we have uploaded a root pruning fact sheet. So there's some excellent information in the fact sheet there on how to do root pruning, why you might want to do that. I see in the comments discussion on Saskatoon pie. So Saskatoons are one of those species that regenerate through root pruning. Something to consider if you're looking for another row of Saskatoons near your first row. Need some more pies. Let's see. We have that Google Earth, a Google Earth information sheet that covers how to use Google Earth to do a site plan for your planting. So that's got something to keep in mind when you are planning out how many trees potentially you're looking for and what other areas are on your landscape to consider. As well, on our website, we have the Alberta Tree Info table. So if you're looking at for some of the more rare trees that may work for your planting but aren't typically seen everywhere, that would be a place to look as well. And of course, we'll have all of these resources available, and we can share an information sheet with everyone who's attending the workshops so that these references can be easily found when you're developing your planting projects. Let's see. Bob, did you have anything further to share?
Yeah, so I'll share my screen here and we can go over the last few slides. Yeah, I was just in the chat there. Hopefully I was able to answer some of those questions that were coming in. I know we'll have a short period at the end of the presentation to go over those questions a bit more. Just go here. Okay, yeah, so as Megan was mentioning before, we had those excellent resources, and I know the planting assessment is on our website, same with the root pruning, and if you go under the resources tab on our website, we have a lot of information, whether it's through workbooks, worksheets, fact sheets, or articles. And then we'll post in the chat here or afterwards the Google Earth and Excel tutorial as well as that tree info table, which is an excellent resource for ultimately figuring out what trees are going to be best for your area and what they can provide for you. So really convenient source for designing shelter belts. Yeah, in conclusion, as we've gone over, there's a ton of reasons for adding forested or treed areas to your property, because there's a ton of benefits. But in doing so, there's different strategies or different ways you can go about implementing that, whether you're going for shelter belts or eco buffers. And both strategies work. Depending on your goals for the area, both will bring benefits. So can't really go wrong with either or. It ultimately comes down to what your goals for your land are. Yeah, I'm coming into the rest of this presentation. On Friday, we're going to have our advanced shelter build presentation. So that's basically going to be going more in depth to some of the topics we covered today, such as designing shelter builds for wildlife use, really diving more into the design for water management, whether it's for swales or dugouts or snow catchment, as well as more of the design process for shelter belts and eco buffers, and some more advanced techniques for doing prep if the site or area you're doing a shelter build is special in terms of geography, and then doing that kind of assessment or survival assessments down the road. So if you enjoyed this presentation or you found anything that got you more interested, I think you'll benefit a lot from the Friday's presentation, as well as if you reach out to us and there's something we didn't quite touch on or not enough, we'll be sure to include some more information on Friday for you. So that's what's going to be happening Friday. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And yeah, so that kind of concludes the basic 101 on shelter builds and eco buffers. Obviously, there's a lot of information that we can delve into, but hopefully we kind of covered the basic idea of shelter builds and eco buffers. And now we have some extra time here to kind of answer more, better answer some of these questions in the chat. And feel free to post some questions if you haven't already. I'm just going to open up. Okay.
So we'll ask a few questions here. I've kind of been monitoring the chat and taking some notes.
Yeah.
And then also I just want to make sure people stick around because we're not quite done. We do have a presentation from Becky as well at Northern Sunrise County about their ALUS program. So Bob's done a really great job of keeping track of the comments or the questions in the chat as well, and has actually answered a lot of them. I'm just going to start here. Sharon Lowe, you have your hand up. Did you want to unmute and ask a question? No? Okay. Okay. So a couple really great questions. The first one that's been asked a few times is just whether this recording and or these slides are going to be available after the fact. So for sure the recording will be. Megan and Bob, are we also able to share the slides, like a PDF of them? Perfect. So we'll send those out as a link after the sessions. So the first question that we had was from Play2, awesome screen name. And that was, what do you suggest for protecting establishing trees from wildlife damage?
Yeah, so I know I tried to answer that earlier, but there's obviously a lot to that question for sure. And it ultimately kind of comes down to the species in question that's kind of acting as the pest. So oftentimes you'll find meadow voles will prey on freshly planted seedlings. So in kind of in that case, mowing around them, kind of reducing that habitat for them to hide and in the tall grass, and which is their kind of primary habitat. So kind of eliminating their preferred habitat around those seedlings could definitely help, as well as potentially planting the species that will attract them in a different area. So kind of drawing them away from your specific site that's being targeted, as well as, like Megan mentioned before, the tree guild kind of idea of protecting a certain species by surrounding it with other species that potentially the predator won't enjoy, as well as encouraging natural predation. So being careful not to, if you have snags, which are dead or dying trees in the area, that will encourage more birds of prey in the area to use them, and then that can help with population control. And then okay, so we got a specific example: branches get eaten, broken off, or chewed completely. 8-foot willow and mountain ash were eaten down to ground level. Wow. That's a hungry critter there. So yeah, deer and moose in the area. So yeah, so as species get taller, that's when it's trickier to protect them. Initially, as with seedlings, you can use the translucent tubing to protect them when they're younger, as well as different fencing. So when they become more established, it definitely becomes trickier. Trying to think. Ultimately, as moose and deer, it shouldn't be, unless you have a really intense population in the area, they shouldn't do enough damage to completely affect an area. But Megan's going to jump in here.
So we have lots of questions that come in on this, and depending on just how starving or hungry those animals are, farmers and landowners have gone to different lengths to protect their trees. So I have I can share an example here. I'll upload it after I'm done explaining. So I have a farmer who's gone to the trouble of putting stucco wire, so about 4-foot high stucco wire around their white spruce trees to protect them from browse. So you can, basically a barrier. So fencing to fence off the planting completely is an option, and then to kind of put any kind of deterrent that's are going to keep those animals away. So I've seen pipe plates on a lath being placed in the area to kind of provide that motion and deter animals, or other deterrents. So we have some information on our website on that. If we don't, it will be put up shortly. We have some developed, and then companion planting, or planting, I guess, deterrents. So species that may be particularly more desirable than the plants you're looking to keep, kind of the bait and switch. So if you plant something really good and the areas they're accessing your property from, they would be more drawn to those plantings instead of coming to eat those species that you're looking to protect.
Great, and we had a new question in the chat from Gary Lewis. In the advanced webinar, will we be covering grass and forbs seed mixes incorporated into shelter belts? And if not, what do you recommend?
Yes, we'll cover some of those cover crop species in our advanced session for sure. So that's part of kind of the maintenance and the site prep. And we've got different species for different ecosystem services as well. So there's a bit of information there.
All right, stay tuned. Same bat time, same bat place on Friday. This is your draw. Make sure you come. And is Oz available to help with design and choosing species for specific projects? And what does that process look like?
Yeah, so Oz is available for helping folks in choosing species design and different factors to consider in shelter belt plantings. lots of our county members they pay a retainer for Oz services, and that ensures that we can help county members to the fullest that they may need. Otherwise, we can provide some basic information, but as far as different funding options are out there to support varying levels of help from Oz, we can definitely let you know. Give us an email or a call, and we can move forward from there.
Awesome. Well, Bob's done such a great job of answering all the questions in the chat, and it's getting a little bit late. I'm actually just recognizing how many people are joining us from Ontario and Quebec and places outside of the mountain time zone. So it's 8:30 here. It's potentially as late as 10:30 or even later for some of them. So so let's move to Becky's presentation with Northern Sunrise County, and we can always stick around and answer some more questions at the end if that's good. Becky, did you want to share your screen?
Should be there.
There you go.
Okay. So everyone, I'm so glad you could join us all this evening, and I'm sure you're all feeling a little bit inspired after that webinar presentation. So I'm just going to take a few minutes here to give you a high-level overview of the ALUS program and what it could do for you. So Aldo Leopold, known as North America's father of wildlife conservation, was onto something some 87 years ago. He believed that private landowners, for the most part the farmers, were the key to conservation, and he is 100% correct. And this would be the principle upon which ALUS Canada was created. So ALUS's mission is to enable Canadians to provide direct support to a national network of farmers and ranchers that are delivering ecological goods and services in their communities. ALUS has the mechanism in place to deliver financial support to farmers in a wide range of local communities. Each of these communities are ready to deliver multiple acres of conservation benefits for all Canadians. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'll let this great little video tell the ALUS story. This production was created by Parkland, Red Deer, and Vermilion counties and was made possible through funding provided by the Alberta government.
As a farmer, you know better than anyone the hills, the valleys, the streams, and the very soil your crops and livestock thrive on. You are the steward of your land. Your commitment to a sustainable operation creates a healthier environment for everyone, and we think you should be paid for that commitment. Sounds too good to be true, right? Not anymore, thanks to the ALUS program. In Alberta and across Canada, the ALUS program supports projects that create clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, and many other ecosystem services. ALUS works with landowners to rebuild natural environments on marginal lands, and the end result benefits everyone, farmers and ranchers, and the people of surrounding communities, all of whom can enjoy the results of clean air, clean water, and greater biodiversity. ALUS is community developed and farmer delivered, so it's the locals who decide how best to deliver ALUS in their area, from the farmer right through to the program decision makers. It's built from the ground up, with funding from many sources. ALUS shares the project costs with you and provides annual payments to recognize your commitment to producing ecosystem services. In the end, ALUS strengthens your agricultural operation, improves the environment, and enhances your community, and we accomplish all this together. To learn more about your local ALUS program and how you can get involved, contact us today. Visit the ALUS Canada website at alus.ca.
So when we look at the program, ALUS has created 8 core principles. For that, we want it farmer delivered and community developed. Agricultural producers are in a unique position to provide important solutions to pressing conservation challenges. With program development at the community level, we're able to target local ag and environmental priorities. The delivery of the ALUS program is intended to complement existing conservation program frameworks. The program focuses on marginal and ecologically sensitive areas that can be managed in a different manner. ALUS projects are independently monitored, verified, and audited. Using sound scientific principles and guidelines, ALUS provides valuable support for the design and implementation of green infrastructure projects. And finally, farmers and ranchers who choose to participate in the ALUS program have flexible agreements that suit their operations. The ecosystem services produced by these projects have an economic value, and it's one that ALUS is actively developing. Of the 30 ALUS communities in Canada, 15 of them are in Alberta, with Northern Sunrise County being the most northerly community. And if you're anything like me, you're probably asking, why is the program so popular in Alberta? So I put the question out there, and although nobody has a definitive answer, it is thought the magic formula is a coalition of the willing. We have producers that are using best management practices. We have municipality agricultural departments. We're here to help you. We're providing programs and resources like ALUS. We have agricultural service boards that are creating and promoting new policies at the provincial level. And we have market mechanisms that ALUS Canada is a part of. Did you know last year over $305 billion was invested in green bonds? And these are fixed income instruments designed specifically to support climate-related and environmental projects. And then we have awesome people like you. We're all continually learning and adapting to new ways and doing better. And when we put all this together, I see the key to success that we all benefit from. You truly are the boots on the ground, making a difference 1 acre at a time. So now I just want to share with you a local project that we've been working on, and it's a pollinator project. And for this project, the bee producer wished to increase the food source for their bees by planting a pollinator belt of native trees and shrubs, many of which have been discussed here tonight. So there was also some non-native that were in there, such as, oh, no, it's escaped me. When the project covers about 0.2 acres of land, and we planted around 700 trees and shrubs. And we also used the hemp weed suppression mats from Biocomposite in Drayton Valley. And this was to help combat vegetation issues. So in June 19th of 2018 is when we did the initial planting. I was back out there during the long, hot, dry spring of 2019. There are challenges were drought and vegetation control, and the hemp mats were a savior. A year later, with a nice wet spring, we can see how it contributed to the growth in 2020. And it's with the assistance of the junior forest rangers that we were able to help the grateful producer with some vegetation control this year, or last year in 2020. And it will be very interesting to see what's happening in this field next year. And our participant in this project, she is actually on the line today with us. So if there's any questions, Karina could address them. So the ALUS program, it opens doors for us to work with community groups and members. And I absolutely love the opportunities that it presents. And I know the kids love it too. We have great time out there. So we look at our funding. Of course, we are receiving funding through ALUS Canada and Northern Sunrise County. We've also received funding through the Alberta Conservation Association. We've received a lot of funding through the Alberta government through the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Fund. We've also seen funding from the federal government under the Environmental Damages Fund, And at the center of it, we have our local producer who is implementing and paying for 50% of these projects. So we have several project partners, and it's often ALUS Northern Sunrise can access resources that are not readily available to individuals, which then I can pass along to the producer. And it's with the assistance of various non-government partners that the ALUS program is an effective mechanism for technical supports. I am the program coordinator. I am here to bring all of us together so we can bring these visions to fruition. ALUS Northern Sunrise is a strong program, but we would not be where we are today without the essential partnerships we have developed in the county and across the country. The strength of the team is each individual member, and the strength of each member is the team. Now get out there and look for your marginal lands on your property and contact your local ALUS coordinator. Your project could be a fit for the program. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a wealth of great information. Thank you to Oz and Alice for making this happen. Thanks.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Becky. So, if you are inspired today and an ecobuffer or shelterbelt seems like something that you might want to do on your land, ALUS may be a potential fit for funding for that. So definitely check out alus.ca, see if we're in your area. And if we're not, you can always still send us a message, and we do kind of track that. And as new partnerships develop, we can always get back in touch as well. So just following up with any other questions, Karina, I was wondering if you're on the line and willing to share, sorry to put you on the spot, but what might have enticed you to undertake your ALUS project and how that may fit into the whole ecobuffers and shelter belts and all of the opportunity that's out there?
Hi, Christine. So I am here. Unfortunately, I'm worried if I put my video on, you're going to lose me. So you're just going to hear my voice tonight. I was just actually typing in my answer to you, and I can't quite type fast enough. So it was my first ALUS seminar that really spiked my interest in wanting to do this. And with the great assistance from Becky and the ALUS program that I attended as well, that's really all I needed to get this done. I knew I wanted to do more for the pollinators out there, just because we've lost a lot of the natural flowers in our ditches and in other areas, just with different methods of cleaning the ditches. So I knew there was something that I could do, and that's where I really wanted to do this. And of course, being beekeepers as well, there's also that part as well, but knowing that there's so many different pollinator insects out there, that I knew I could help more than just the bees. So it's wonderful to go out into the field, and I started seeing some different butterflies out there, and I always hear the bees humming out there, so it's great. And I started seeing some native bees out there as well now, so it's really doing well. I have to say, last year I was quite aggressive to my wonderful Canadian thistle. So I did take to spraying that. Usually I try not to spray stuff, but to be honest, plucking was not working. So yeah, I took it upon myself and I sprayed. So I'm looking forward to this spring and seeing what it looks like. But I can tell you there's quite a few of the trees that are poking up through the snow, which is wonderful to see. And the lilacs are starting to get a little thicker. The dogwoods are doing really well. So yeah, it's starting to look good.
That's great. Thanks for sharing your experience. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
No problem at all. I'm sorry, you just can't see me.
Well, you have a beautiful voice. So
well, thank you.
It's all good. All right, so are there any other questions? I know there were a few others in the chat that have been answered in the chat, and we can certainly revisit them, but anyone brave enough, if you want to unmute, we'd like to save the Q&A mostly for like landowners, producers in the area, kind of residents, stuff like that. If you are a contractor on the line, definitely we can help field some of those kinds of more technical questions, probably offline. If you want to send an email really to like any of the presenters here, we can get you in touch with the appropriate person. Oh, yes, sorry, there was one that I've missed here. So there's been a couple of people now asking about a cost per mile estimate for incorporating an ecobuffer. So somebody, first person to ask it is living on a section, and our goal is to incorporate an ecobuffer over the entire perimeter. What would a cost estimate per mile length be?
I guess I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you a dollar amount. So but I can tell you some of the variables that come into play there. So depending on the species of plants that you're looking for, costs for a seedling can be from like 79 cents to several dollars a seedling. So 79 cents to $5.25, depending on if you're looking for some of those maybe less common species. So maybe your white spruce, maybe 79 cents per seedling. And then this year, for example, depending on nursery stock and how good all of the different seedlings are doing in their nurseries, dogwoods, we're looking at one supplier had those at about $5.50 a seedling. So the price of your individual species can vary as well. You want to look at what type of site preparation you're doing. So if you're looking at doing some rototilling and what your costs would be on rototilling for that. If you're looking at hemp mats, for example, to put around your seedlings, often we quote on $1 a mat. So depending on how many seedlings you have, that number can add up. If you're doing a biodegradable mulch, that there's different costs associated with that. Let's see. And then overall success. So how many of those trees are you going to be planting again the next year? Do you need any irrigation equipment to support your newly planted trees? If you're doing all the way around your section, there's a good chance you'll need some drip lines laid so that you can keep up with watering. But that's developing planting plans and cost estimates. That's something that Oz can help with. Given projects that need kind of a significant amount of help, sometimes we do charge a fee for that service if there isn't a retainer with the county. And we can talk about that, give us a call or an email. But we're not for profit, so our fees are based on like a cost recovery basis. So we're basically just covering our salary costs to help people out on those. But yeah, lots of factors. Anyway, it's not an easy question to answer, and it depends on year to year, location, and site conditions.
Sure. Yeah, and so we also had questions, any tips for filling in holes or gaps in a 30-year-old spruce windbreak? You mentioned it might be extra windy, so would shrubs be a start?
Absolutely. So starting with some of those more resilient, faster growing species to provide that microclimate and break maybe that wind funnel that may be moving through the gap in your shelter belt. And then you want to, from there, maybe plant your white spruce that's more shade tolerant, a good underplant species. So it's going to thrive in that protected area once you have your shrubs established, and it'll grow from there.
Perfect. And that question came from Maria Witt. She's giving a thumbs up. So did that answer? She had a follow-up question. You were mentioning more density. She said, I like this idea. How dense, and have you had success with CAP for funding projects like this?
Can you say that question again?
You're mentioning more density. I like this idea. How dense, and have you had success with CAP for funding projects like this?
Well, we have had success utilizing CAP in funding projects, though everyone is waiting with bated breath to see what comes out in the next funding cycle for CAP. So we'll see what comes from the federal government, and then our provincial government establishes those different priority areas, and we'll see what kind of funding opportunities are out there. Density, the best part of density is it kind of reduces that need for any kind of weed control or grass control in between your trees. So we will cover that in a lot more detail on Friday. We'll go into some kind of designs for ecobuffers. But yeah, density is something to consider for sure, especially with native species.
Perfect. And just for people who aren't engrossed in that acronym world all the time. CAP does stand for the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. So it's a federal provincial funding program that has been of great help to a lot of producers over the last few years. So you may have known it as Growing Forward or Growing Forward 2 in its previous iterations. Like many government funding programs, it's gone through a couple of name changes, and who knows what names may be in the future. So. Okay, and then there was a fairly simple question about where can people actually obtain hemp mats? And we did have one answer in the chat, which was Biocomposite in Drayton Valley, but were there any other suggested suppliers?
I could look into our records, though most recently we had, yeah, that's where we had sourced them from.
Perfect. And I actually think that that is all the questions. There were a few comments as well that were excellent throughout the chat. So hopefully people were keeping an eye on those. If I've missed your question, now's your time to yell. Or if something has occurred to you that you don't want to type out, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I just saw Sally adding on to different areas for planting, and yes, we'll be addressing that in the advanced one for sure, because yeah, that definitely plays a role in site suitability and what you can do as far as different types of prep to best establish the planting for that site. So
Something to keep in mind for your roadsides and ditches would be to look at the road allowances in your county. So those may vary slightly, but just to keep that in mind, just so you know if you do have room to plant where you're thinking, or maybe that's all road allowance.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so that was a good plug for attending Friday. It's the same time, and we are going to be talking about more advanced stuff. So I've dropped the link down below. If you haven't registered yet, you can go ahead and do that, and then you'll get the Zoom link just like you did tonight. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. This was a great turnout, and thank you so much to Oz and to Becky for sharing your expertise, and to all of you for sharing your expertise in the chat and your questions and things like that. We really appreciate it. So,
thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
thanks, Christine.
And thank you for having us and listening to us. We really are very passionate about growing trees, and we're happy to share with anyone who will listen.
That's great. So we will also round up all of those resources that were mentioned today, because there were a plethora of really excellent resources. That species guide is something that I'm definitely going to be looking into for planning on my own property. That's an amazing resource, as is that the planning assessment tool and all of those kinds of pieces. So we'll round those up, and then we'll also be sending out the links to these recordings, and we'll send that all probably as a package. And I'm thinking that we'll send it all as one big package after the advanced session. So stay tuned for that info, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good
Good
night.
Friday.